Slotus back again with the series on Calvinism. I want to start off with this next lecture discussing the doctrine of God. Just some certain attributes, not all of them. Certainly not attempting to prove his existence in any way. Presuppositionalist, so kind of arguments don't tend to fly with me for the most part. But I want to talk about one particular attribute, the self-sufficiency of God. Calvinism, before we even attempt to get into the 5 points, like I said in the previous lecture, begins and ends with the glory of God. Therefore, it is important that we understand what kind of God that we're dealing with, what type of God we're seeking salvation from. Or who's giving salvation out to us, if we want to put it that way. So I want to start off by talking about the self-sufficiency of God, and this is obviously going to be a very high view of God, and I think it's theism in its purest and strongest form, as it should be, but also as it most often is not in many evangelical Christian circles. So the self-sufficiency of God. When we speak of sufficiency, for the most part, we speak of having enough. Logic, when I say something is a sufficient condition for something to take place, that means that once this a certain amount of condition is met, then something can do whatever it is that it needs to do. For instance, it is sufficient for me that I have water, air, food, and shelter in order to survive. That's speaking at a very biological level, but those things would be sufficient. Now, obviously, I could get into luxury, and then, well, I need Fiji water, and I need pizza, and I need this and that. Those technically, those things wouldn't be. They'd be a little more than sufficient, but sufficient would just be basic water, basic food, some sort of nourishment of any kind. In order for me to exist, the sufficient conditions that are necessary for me to exist, I obviously must have parents that have had me as an offspring. I have to, again, be dependent upon air, upon water, good atmospheric pressure, all those types of things like that. Shelter, I need those types of things to be sustained. They are things that I am dependent upon. God, however, depends on nothing. He depends on no one for his existence, to exist, to do anything that he wants to do, to be anything that he is. God depends on nothing outside of himself. Rather, he exists in and of himself, and he contains everything within himself. We can use the word aseity here. Aseity is a fancy word that comes from the Latin verbs ase, which means from itself. We can use that word aseity to describe this attribute of God. Basically, again, that God depends on nothing other than his own being for all that he is and does. The important understanding to take away, as John Feinberg states in his work No One Like Him, is that there are not properties independent of God upon which he depends in order to have the constituted attributes that he possesses. Rather, God is self-reliant. He depends on nothing outside of his Trinitarian self to exist or to express himself or his attributes. Some of the ancients have said that the reason why God created was so that he could show off his love, or so that he could have somebody to love. But if we understand aseity right, and what this is saying, this would mean that in and of himself, in and of his Trinitarian being, God exists perfectly, showing love within the Trinity. So he doesn't need creatures to show his love. He doesn't need creatures to show off how gracious he is. God knows that within himself. The Father, the Son, and the Spirit, they know perfectly all of the attributes of God without having them to be shown to anybody other than the creature. God exists perfectly within himself. Now, this is a very important concept that it is God alone who is able to exist in this manner. Well, obviously, like I said, anything that is created exists contingently and has to rely on God's sustaining providence on creation. God, rather, doesn't depend on anybody to help him or to cause him to exist, or else that thing would be God. Again, it's an important concept because this is going to mean that God is independent in all things. Even his choices and his purposes are independent of influences from anything other than his own being. God's will and choices are absolutely self-determined. That is, his choices depend on his own desires and purposes alone, and he certainly has the power to actualize these choices. So to be clear on the self-sufficiency and understanding who the one true God is, and this will be demonstrated from Scripture, is that God alone is sufficient for his existence, for his desires, for his will, and for his purposes. He does not need, nor does he take counsel with the creature, and this is going to play, within the idea of how most people understand foreknowledge, and what's typically the prescient view of foreknowledge. But that means that God doesn't look outside of himself, say to the future, down the corridors of time, as some people like to say, to see how he's then going to react to creation. Rather, God himself, within himself, according to his own will, desires, and purposes, decrees and self-determines how creation is going to be. This is, I guess, the first part of Part 2, Part 2a, I guess we could say. In the next lecture, which should be following this, I will demonstrate from Scripture that indeed the Aseity of God is the nature of the one true God that is depicted in the Bible.